So could you make dinner every week? And I said, I was thinking that if you just made pizza, homemade pizza every Sunday, that then it would be a little easier on you. You'd have like some of the responsibility, but not this like constantly shifting task. Because that's part of why making dinner is hard. One, you got to pick something every night. And two, sometimes you're like not quite sure how long it'll take or if it'll turn out, right? There's a lot of unknowns. You're listening to the Healthy Parenting Handbook podcast, just the thing we all said we needed when we first became parents. Remember that? Where is the handbook for this? I'm your host, Katie Kimball from Kids Cook Real Food, and every week I bring together experts in the fields of health, parenting, nutrition, and more to help you parents who really want to raise healthy, independent kids. My friends, parenting is truly the toughest and yet the most rewarding job in the world. Thank you for joining me to consult this Healthy Parenting Handbook, your guide to raising kids intentionally. Please, if you've got a moment, leave a review on Apple Podcasts or anywhere you listen to podcasts so that others can find us too. Today is a solo podcast. I was thinking recently that I tell a specific story or sort of set of stories quite often when I am a guest on other people's podcasts. And I realized, oh my goodness, I don't know if I've ever shared this officially with my own audience. So we're going to talk today about the process that we've used here in the Kids Cook Real Food household of gradually releasing responsibility and teaching kids to make an entire meal for themselves and then shifting into meal planning. So it's definitely it's a multi-step, multi-year process. Super quick note before I get started, the Healthy Parenting Handbook podcast just turned 1. Woo! Happy birthday! We're going to have a party. So if you do leave that review like I requested in the intro, you get an invite to the Ask Me Anything Healthy Parenting Handbook podcast birthday party. And you get an entry for a prize. You get another entry for a prize if you ask a question, and you get lots of entries for prizes if you get to show up live. The podcast birthday party is going to be on March 2nd, 2025. Don't despair if you're listening to this after that point. It's okay if you missed it, but I would love to have you there. So be sure to go to kidscookrealfood.com/party and check out the instructions to get your invite to the podcast birthday party. Okay, let's jump in. When my own kids first started making a whole meal by themselves, it actually grew more out of desperation than me trying to be a good and intentional parent and passing on life skills to them. I think this is how a lot of us end up parenting. Sometimes it's super intentional. Sometimes it's like, oh my gosh, we just have a need and maybe the kids can help fill it. So I had already taught my 3 older kids to cook. If you know my story, when my oldest Paul was 10 years old and in 4th grade, he did a how-to speech in his 4th grade classroom, and he demonstrated how to make guacamole. He used the chef's knife. It was really cool, but I had a bit of a moment realizing guacamole was the only thing he could make. So it was that summer after Paul's 4th grade when my older 3 kids were 10, 7, and 4 that I strategically and intentionally taught them to cook. And then we created the Kids Cook Real Food e-course. Now, a couple years later, I really felt a call on my heart to help out with the high school youth group at our church. Now, high school youth group was like 5:30 to 7 p.m. on Sunday nights, something like that timing wise. And I told my husband, I really would like to do this. And his response was, oh, no. He said, I know what this will look like. This will end up being you getting the dinner like half to 3/4 of the way finished, sort of throwing some food at us and shrieking in stress and running out of the house and leaving all of us like shell-shocked there with this dinner that may or may not even be cooked and stuck with like all of your like stress juice. And he's probably right. One of my skills is not getting dinner on the table in a very timely fashion, particularly early in the day, like before 6, and I'd have to leave at 5 or maybe before that to get to this event. So he said, no way, Jose. And I'm a problem solver. So I said, but what if Paul and Leah, who were at the time 12 and 9, said, what if they could do dinner so that I didn't have to, so that I had that freedom to leave when I needed to leave to be fairly on time for high school youth group. So I asked Paul and Leah, I said, I have this idea and it would be a way for like our whole family in some sense to serve the kids at church, because I would really like to go serve the kids at church in person, but I can't do that. Dad doesn't think I can do that logistically and make dinner. And so could you make dinner every week? And I said, I was thinking that if you just made pizza, homemade pizza every Sunday, that then it would be a little easier on you. You'd have like some of the responsibility, but not this like constantly shifting task. Because that's part of why making dinner is hard. One, you got to pick something every night. And two, sometimes you're like not quite sure how long it'll take or if it'll turn out, right? There's a lot of unknowns as adults cooking. And in my childhood, we pretty much always had pizza on Sundays. So that was like reminiscent for me. And they said, okay. They said, we think we can do this. So I implemented a strategic plan, right? It grew out of desperation, but I am an intentional parent. So I implemented this very strategic plan. And step one, of course, was that they were going to make the same dish, the same meal every week, every Sunday night for a whole school year. And then I wasn't going to throw them to the wolves the first night, but a couple weeks before youth group was supposed to start, I said, all right, we're making pizza tonight. And we did a 3-part system. First, they watched me as I narrated out loud. Then I watched them as I gave little tips and, tricks and stuff and just little reminders from behind them. And then a week or two later, they got to do it completely by themselves without me even being there. That's what I would definitely I think that's a wonderful system. And then we're repeating that meal to mastery. So whether that's a full school year, like maybe you go half of a school year or a couple months, I think this is a great way. I always call it the gradual release of responsibility. That's literally all of parenting, is that letting out of the apron strings and this gradual release of responsibility from birth to whenever your child leaves home. And we're always giving them a little bit more and a little bit more. So instead of throwing them into the whole process of making dinner, I thought, first, let's just give them one recipe. They can learn that to mastery. And then what we did was on the second full school year, then every other week they got to make their old favorite homemade pizza. And on the weeks in between, they had to plan something different. It could be a recipe that they'd seen me make a million times, right? It could be a family favorite, or it could be something new. My daughter loves looking up new recipes and she likes trying new things. So she would often be the sort of leader on trying brand new recipes. And then if Paul was sort of getting his way, he'd say, oh, let's make cheeseburger soup, or let's make pinto gallo, some of these recipes that I made often as a family. We've replicated this process with child number 3, John. So when he was going into 7th grade, he was 12 years old, and we said, okay, oh my goodness. Paul was 12 when he started making dinner once a week. So this is going to be your new responsibility, which, by the way, side note, one thing that we do also as a family, as sort of one of our traditions, is that every time the child's baptism anniversary comes around, so it's kind of like the birthday, but it's like the birthday in the church. We do it for their baptism birthday instead of their regular birthday. We give them a new privilege and a new responsibility. So these have included things like taking out the trash as a responsibility, or wiping the table after dinner, something new that they could do on a weekly or daily basis. Some of the privileges have included crossing the street by yourself, being able to have a friend sleep over, or take a friend camping, and getting social media. It's funny, really, to look back at we have little pieces of paper in an envelope. And we were just looking back because we celebrated one of our kids' baptism birthdays last week. And I was thinking it's so interesting to see the progression of privileges and responsibilities. When the kids are 4 and 5, their responsibility is that they now have to sit still with no toys during family prayer, for example. And how different is that from you're responsible for making a meal once a week, right? We forget as parents, how much our kids progress in just a small handful of years. Anyway, that was my side note. You can take that as a little routine for your family if you've got young children. Totally could be done on birthdays and not baptism birthdays. Anyway, so it was John's new responsibility, that 7th grade, 12-year-old year, to make a meal once a week. And we did a very similar process with him. That whole first school year, he was able to make tacos. We're a family. We could eat pizza once a week, no problem. We can eat tacos once a week, no problem. We actually already had the routine of having tacos once a week, but my husband made that meal. And so my husband passed on his meal of tacos to John. And he did it really similarly to what I did. Not exactly, because he had his own little flair, but it took about 4 weeks. So on week number 1, my husband did most of the work, talked through it just like I did with Paul and Leah, and told John, here's where you find everything. Here's how much you use, right? Here's how you do you remember how to brown meat, made sure that he had all the component skills. And then week 2, they cooked side by side. Week 3, I think, is when my husband sort of backed off and he said, I'm gonna be here. I'll be sort of in the area and I'll be kind of keeping an eye on you and giving you reminders. And then week 4, he was just available for questions if John needed him. By week 5, John was totally independent on his own. And within a few months, John had it like down to the minute. All of them did. When you make a recipe to mastery, you get it down. Like Paul and Leah knew we need to walk into the kitchen at like 4:47 or something. They had it down to the minute in order to make dinner for like a 6 p.m. start. They had a playlist that they would play. They knew that when the pizza was in the oven for like the first portion, they would get all the salad and raw veggie ingredients ready, and then they could top the pizza, put it back in the oven. They knew they'd have time to play cards. So fun. By the way, you can go to kidscookrealfood.com/pizza and see Paul and Leah's rendition of doing that. They filmed themselves and completely made this video on their own and edited it. Paul edited it himself. So it definitely has like I don't know if he was like 13 or 14 at the time. It's got like a 14 or 15-year-old boy's fun flair, but it might be a good one to see this. It's actually a grain-free, dairy-free except for the cheese, pizza crust. And then Leah is dairy-free. So they would either just leave an end that's dairy-free or we would use dairy-free cheese on a little portion. Anyway, it's a fun video for your kids to watch. So the process we used is first to give them one recipe that they could make for an extended period of time. Next, we would slowly pass on that process. Like I said, with Paul and Leah, like we just had lots of leftover pizza. Like we made the same recipe twice in a row on the same night. And then the next week I was there in the house for questions. And the following week I was completely gone. With my husband and the tacos, they did it a little bit slower. They took more weeks, but it was totally fine. Like both are great. And then with John, so he's in his 8th grade year right now. So we said, oh, guess what? With Paul and Leah, they got to make the same recipe the whole school year. And then they had to start alternating weeks. So buddy, you get to do that too. And he's just in the first little bit here of having to do those alternating weeks where he gets his Old Faithful taco meal and then he's got to figure out something else. And we're talking about that meal planning, right? What has to be thawed? Do you have all your ingredients? It's a much bigger skill to be planning something new each time, because now you need even more forward thinking and planning ahead skills. He just a couple of weeks ago, he decided, I said, John, I don't know, like, what do you think? Do you have any ideas? He didn't. And I had my freezer list in front of me. I said, well, by the way, like we have some homemade pesto in the freezer that I've been thinking needs to be used. He's like, oh, cool. What can I do with pesto? So we talked it out. He decided to just make some gluten-free pasta and mix the pesto in. And then for the meat, he used some like Costco organic sausages and sliced those up. And I didn't talk through with him a lot of the process. Like that, what I just told you is pretty much what we did, he and I. And so when he was starting to make this meal, I was actually still working here in the office. And I thought, oh boy, it's going to be the night of 11 dozen questions. Like I just thought he would need so much help. I was so impressed. I was blown away. I remember he came in the office once and he asked like how much pasta to use. 1 box, 2 box, box and a half. He didn't really know. I never know how much pasta to use. So that's like super valid question. But I just expected him to need a lot of assistance and he didn't. So I really can see that he's gaining that confidence in the kitchen. He's able to problem solve. He's able to just kind of say, well, I think I can figure this out, or I think I can, read the box and follow it. I was so proud of him. And again, really blown away. Like it pains me to admit it, but I expected him to need more help than he needed. I didn't expect him to fail, but I did expect him to need more help than he did. So I was blown away. And this is what happens. This is what happens when we teach our kids to cook. When we give them, like in Kids Cook Real Food, we give them the component pieces. We give them the tools in their toolbox, the skills that they need to make all sorts of recipes. And we always hope that we also give them the confidence to approach those recipes with a little bit of bravery and a little bit of, just knowing that I can make this, that I can do this recipe. And this is how it plays out. Now, like if you're doing the math, if John is 13, that means Leah's 16 and Paul's 19. And then he's out of high school. He started his own business, but he is still living at home. And part of his contract for living at home is that he still needs to make a meal a week. So now I've got 1, 2, 3 meals every week being made by the Kimball kids. And in fact, I mentioned we just had a baptism birthday a week or two ago, and that was Gabe, child 4. He's 10, and he actually requested his own responsibility. He said, I would really like to be John's like helper chef, sous chef every week when he makes his meal. And so that's what we gave him. That's what we granted. And so now he's learning along with John. It's kind of like when Paul and Leah were making the pizza together, except that in that case, the younger child was definitely in the leadership role. My girl, those of you who might have girls and boys could potentially see how that played out. So this is great. Like John and Gabe get to communicate together. They get to work together. They get to kind of build their bonds as brothers. I always hear them laughing because he's sort of been doing this, which is what's funny. So now it's his expected responsibility. But I would say for the last couple months, if Gabe can't find a friend, he's so social that he just wants to be with people and he wants to be with like his brother John. And so John's cooking and Gabe will come in and be like, I'll peel and cut a cucumber for you. What can I do to help? So it's really cool. Gabe's going to be building his skills, and eventually in a couple of years, we'll have 4 meals made by kids. Although we're going to lose one probably. Paul will move out eventually, right? Don't you think? I think Paul will move out eventually. The last little tip that I want to talk to you about is that meal planning component, right? Again, that's stripped away when the kids make the same meal for a number of months or for a whole school year. They don't have to worry about the meal planning. And in fact, we would like thaw the meat for John. So he was able to just walk into the kitchen and do the physical labor of making tacos. But now we got to ask him, okay, it's the week it's the off week. It's the creative week. What do you think you want to make? And so I think as parents, that's part of the gradual release of responsibility, is to teach them how to think ahead. So we help them talk through, what ingredients do you need? Make sure we have all the ingredients in the house. Are any of the ingredients frozen? Let's figure out like what day do we need to move that meat or that frozen pesto from the freezer to the fridge, and how we thaw that out. How long do you think this recipe will take, right? If it's something they haven't made before, how long does it take to bake? How long do you realistically think it'll take to put it together? Add 10 to 30 minutes, right? Because we're always off. At least I am always off on how long we think it'll take. This is an incredible skill for them, because while they're learning to put the planning ahead skill into effect in the kitchen, they're also going to be able to use that skill of like forecasting, thinking ahead, and planning ahead with things like big projects in middle school or high school. Even as they get into college and adulthood, the process of like buying a house and decorating a house or doing a remodel project, like there are so many, and that's just home life. Like in work life, there are so many opportunities we have to look at something that's coming and think about what we need to do to make that event easier for ourselves when we get there. It does seem, I will warn you that it does seem to take years of reminders for the kids to like completely internalize it. So like I'm still responsible for telling John that it's his week to cook, maybe on a Sunday when I'm meal planning, and like pulling that out of him. Paul and Leah are supposed to remember that they have a dedicated night for cooking. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. So just realistically know that as parents, the word gradual in gradual release of responsibility, it's a thing. It's there for a reason. And it does make sense, right? We can't fully expect to like dump the entire physical and mental load of cooking onto our kids at the same time. The mental load is a big deal. So we keep the mental, we start with just the physical labor, then we slowly pass off some of that mental load of meal planning, and eventually they can take over the full mental load of like, you don't even have to think about that meal on their dedicated day. When we say cooking is hard because it has so much mental load. So if it's hard for us to carry, that's probably a clue telling us that we need to really gradually release that to them, and that they won't be ready until they're toward, in their teens and maybe even their later teens. But when they can handle it, it is a beautiful thing. I hope this has been incredibly helpful. Of course, I want all of my Kids Cook Real Food graduates to be, working toward taking a kids' night to make dinner. If you've got younger kids, I would definitely encourage you to have a dedicated night where they are the sous chef, where they are the helper. And then, probably before even passing on a whole meal to them, like let's say you're starting at 6 or 7, age 6 or 7, you could switch so that then you become the sous chef and they become the lead chef or something like that. There's always ways to slowly and gradually pass off different parts of the process to the kids so that we're not overwhelming them. We're giving them something age and developmentally appropriate, and yet they're still being helpful and they're still like learning these skills and assimilating these skills into their lives. It's so helpful, so very helpful. Thank you for listening. I'm Katie Kimball from Kids Cook Real Food, and I'll see you next week for another episode of the Healthy Parenting Handbook. Don't forget to leave that review. And if you do, go to kidscookrealfood.com/party so that you can get your ticket to the podcast party.